our final panel of the day. And as Sarah and I were just saying, it is deliberate that we leave you that long of a lunch period to network, because at a networking event, if you're not actually getting the time to properly have conversations, you know, you're constantly getting them cut short. So I hope you made some new connections across the different organisations that are here, the different individuals and community members, and across the loch. And I do know we've had folk from both shores here, and we keep doing each of the Shifting Tides events. We'll do one on one shore and then we'll go over and do another on another shore, because we really wanted to create those connectivities amongst the community members. So I'm very happy to be joined, and just to remind people a couple of things. Everybody loved the lunch, yeah? It was a good lunch? So that was Kitchenette, who are local chefs and caterers, and we asked them for them to cater because they really focus on local producers and local suppliers. And then the oysters, for those of you that wanted to taste a Carlingford oyster, they came donated to us from Cian, from Carlingford Oysters, and Cian has been part of another Shifting Tides artist scientist project that both Sarah and Heidi have contributed to, and that Emer, who you may have met, but who made the lovely harvests of the conversations that are going on between artists, scientists and oyster farmers from both shores, and they're up on the posters that you see sitting behind where you were eating. So that's actually Emer listening to the conversations and then harvesting what she's hearing. And so both Sarah and Heidi did presentations about seagrass and native oysters as part of restoration. So that's what those were. So Kitchenette apparently are on Instagram, so you can follow them there. Just want to give them a boost because they were just really good to us, and Cian as well. But we're going to have this panel now. So I introduce to you Sarah McLean from the head of science at the Lochs Agency, who now have an office in Carlingford, down by the Yacht Club, isn't that right? And Heidi, who is doing her PhD based around community seagrass restoration. So you'll hear a lot more about them in a minute. Sarah, we'll start with you, if that's okay. You know, so your current role, the work, and how it connects to the future of Carlingford.
Perfect. Can everybody hear me okay? Yeah. So I'm head of science at Lochs Agency. Lochs Agency is a cross-border body. We are funded 50-50 by the North and the South, and we came about as part of the Good Friday Belfast Agreement. But as I was chatting with some colleagues over lunch there, Lochs Agency has a much longer history than that, and we've actually existed since 1952. And at that point, we were known as the Foyle Fisheries Commission. Our heritage is in Atlantic salmon management, so management of salmon as a commercial resource. But as time has gone on and as species has declined, we are now moving towards a much more conservation-based focus. And we started working in Carlingford after the Good Friday Belfast Agreement, when we became Lochs Agency. And the reason for that is that both Sea Lochs, Foyle and Carlingford are both transboundary waters. So when the border was drawn on the island of Ireland, it was not extended out into the Sea Lochs. So the Sea Lochs are simultaneously in both jurisdictions or in neither jurisdiction, depending on the issue.
And you've been listening, before we go on to Heidi, you've been listening this morning. So I might just ask you, what's been standing out in this context today in relation to that work that you're doing? Because I know you have a huge remit.
Yeah, huge remit. But I think what stood out for me today is that, I think it's something that I constantly think about, is that the lines that we draw on maps are entirely human constructs. When we're all here today as people, recognizing that we are part of the ecosystem, it's just really heartening to see us consider the loch and consider this catchment as a whole.
Great. Heidi, do you want to do the same? Give us a bit about your background and role, and in particularly what you're doing here in Carlingford.
So I'm wrapping up a PhD at Queen's in Belfast, and my research is all about seagrass. Sanjo was talking earlier about how important seagrass is for biodiversity, and it also has this carbon sequestration function. So I try to measure that, how much carbon is in our seagrass. It helps us to build an argument for protecting it. But the other side of my research is social sciences, so I'm interested in what seagrass means to people. How do we value it as a piece of our natural and cultural heritage? So I'm also a director of the Irish Ocean Literacy Network, and at these events I talk about seagrass. Some people might tell me to stop, but I met then Shifting Tides at these events, Susie and Alex, who were also interested in seagrass in the project. So I came down to Carlingford, met some of the divers. They were telling me about the seagrass beds that they dive on subtidally here. And then through extension again, I came part of the Fishery Exchange Project with Suzanne, and that had more of a focus on oysters, but in a previous role, at Ulster Wildlife, I had established some native oyster nurseries as part of a restoration program. So I was just trying to share a little bit about what I knew and also learn from them. So it was just kind of meeting people.
And you have, like ourselves in Shifting Tides, been meeting people all around the loch. Do you think that there is a momentum building around community-led interaction with science and stewardship on this loch or other coastal communities that you've been interacting with in any of those roles?
Yeah, I mean, if we just take Carlingford Loch as an example, this morning showcases just how much momentum is building. And I think that's really exciting. And just to talk about Sandra again, I just loved listening to her talk about how she's her diving journey, and then how you're starting to notice all of the small things. But then she said, and it's just on my doorstep. And that's what really got me. I was like, you know, that's so true. We have to really appreciate what's right there. We don't need to be, you know, going to all the tropical places to see all the amazing wildlife. We have it literally right here.
And one of our audience members here forming this cross-loch group, the Loch Keepers, Morris, asked me this morning, he said, is there a plan? Because I think there was a plan that went up to this date. And, you know, I think there's this need across the, you know, people in the audience here today to understand a bit more about the plans. And so, Sarah, maybe you could just tell us a bit about what role the Lochs Agency plays in relation to any marine planning, or the Lochs planning in particular. And, you know, I know it's not the planning agency, but what's its function in relation to, is there a plan?
If there is a plan, will somebody tell me what the plan is? So Lochs Agency is a statutory consultee. We're a government body. So we are consulted on all major and actually minor development projects that happen on both Carlingford Loch and Loch Foyle. Our job is to ensure that any development does not have a negative impact on the aquatic environment, and particularly our remit species, so Atlantic salmon, sea trout, European eel, that sort of thing. And essentially to ensure that developers are held accountable, to make sure that they have undertaken all of the risk assessments, the habitat regulation assessments, all of the things that they are supposed to do, and they have done it not just as a tick box exercise, but they have done it in a robust and truly transparent manner. So that's what we do. In terms of the grand plan, I think for organisations like Lochs Agency and other government organisations, what we can do is relatively limited in that we have our remit, we have the thing that we can do, and everybody has their bit that they can do, and holistically that forms sort of a big jigsaw puzzle piece. But for stakeholders, that's really difficult to understand, and it's really difficult to see who does what and where all those pieces of the jigsaw puzzle fit in and who has responsibility for what. And that does make it quite difficult to manage expectations as to what it is we actually have the space and the ability to do.
But do tell us a little bit more, because I know I learned listening to you talking to the oyster farmers that the science function in the Lochs Agency has been growing from. So if you go back to, you know, its origins, its heritage, how much science played a part, and you're in role as head of science. How is that helping the agency, or is that changing anything culturally?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is probably a huge part, and Lochs Agency are not alone in that. Our society is changing in general, so this kind of old school standpoint of my house, my rules, we're the competent authority, we do it this way because we say we're doing it this way, that doesn't wash anymore. In a society where we're required to be, rightly so, increasingly more accountable for the decisions that we make, having an independent science team within Lochs Agency means that all of their environmental decisions are made in a really robust way and underpinned by science. So the science team, there's always been a science team at Lochs Agency, okay? But previously it was 2 scientists sitting within the same team that does the enforcement. So the same team that books people for not having a license for their rod, enforces pollution regulations, those sorts of things. So the optics from the outside weren't brilliant because you were sort of marking your own homework. In 2021, the agency set up our independent science team, which I lead, and we sit independent from any other team within Lochs Agency, and we provide robust scientific advice for all the management decisions. So we do the science, we do the surveys. We're actually set up really nicely in that because we've existed for a really long time, we have some really long time series data. And that allows us to make pretty good decisions based on trends and things that we have seen happen before. And that information can be passed to the managers to then make really informed decisions.
Heidi, so coming back to you in relation to, I know you didn't come at all of your work as a PhD student and researcher as a scientist only from the point of view of the marine science. You also came with a social piece and a social science. So thinking about, as Sarah said, it can be really impenetrable for local communities to understand all the different agencies' roles and remits, and yet people here, as you can see, want to lean in. They really want to have a say in what's going on their doorstep, as you said, on what's right beside them. In your research, what do you think is changing or shifting that helps with that?
I mean, it is really challenging to bring all of these worlds together: policy, science, communities. I guess speaking from an academic point of view, there's definitely been a shift towards recognizing the importance of building relationships in the communities that you're working. But I think a lot of the time, one of the issues I kind of see over and over again is timeframes, because scientists work on funded projects, so that could be 6 months to 5 years if you're lucky. And then you have to move on to the next thing that's going to be funded, the new hot topic. So it's actually quite transient in the lifetime of a community that is there for the whole time, like that's their home. So that's something that you're constantly trying to manage and deal with. But there is definitely a shift happening, and we're trying to find ways in academia to recognize the importance of having long-standing relationships.
That's very interesting. Maybe we'll get in a little bit to the relationship that the Shifting Tides Fishery Exchange began to broker, because it was, and we are very similar in the community of voluntary sector. We talk about not having multi-annual funding, short term. So this Creative Ireland project funding was one of the longest funded projects I've been able to work on, and that was 2 years. So that we've been able to be in the community, for long enough to find people, make relationships, and hope to create legacy and support the new groups that are coming up. But in the particular relationship with the oyster farmers, so we convened with Suzanne, who wasn't able to be here today, but she will be having an exhibition in Carlingford, and also in as part of Fiddler's Green. Some of her pieces and the other artists' pieces will be on show. But they brokered a conversation in the Fishery Exchange between oyster farmers in both shores and with yourselves. What's kind of promising about this collaboration? What do you think, having an artist as the person who brought you together with oyster farmers? Sarah, we'll start with you.
I'm actually very excited by this piece of work, as I'm pretty sure it came across that day when I couldn't stop talking. I've been working here in Carlingford with the oyster guys since 2011. And during that time, but probably a post-COVID thing, I think, if I'm honest, I have seen a real paradigm shift from a almost them and us approach, where you have industry and people who are commercially interested in a species or an area of the loch, and scientists and the community groups, and it has been quite siloed. I think what I have got out of being part of the Fishery Exchange project is starting to see those silos breaking down, and starting to see people understand that we're actually all in the same sphere. We're just looking at it from slightly different angles, and there's a lot to be done by working collaboratively.
Heidi, for you, again, artists as brokers.
I thought it was super cool. I hadn't worked with artists in that way before, and the first meeting that I had with Suzanne, so it was just the two of us, the bigger meeting hadn't happened. She was asking me about my research process, and I was explaining how I take samples from the field and prepare them in the lab for analysis, and she was like, that's exactly how I make pigments. I was like, what? And then at the first meeting, she brought along a painting of a crab that she'd done where she'd used sand and sediment and stuff to make the pigments, so the crab was all textured. And I just thought this is like the coolest thing in the world. And then it was, so at a couple of the meetings, we had different producers there who some had their business for a few generations in their family, others are relatively new to the industry. So it was interesting to hear how they operate and the differences between those. But also they're really open to some experimental work. You know, we're talking about native oyster restoration. That's not the species they grow for food and for consumption to sell on. But they were still really keen to see what roles they could play in that.
Yeah, and I've definitely seen that because, again, back to the 2-year project, that 2 years ago, and I know that there's somebody here from Coastwatch, and Karen Dobsky went out with Cian onto the oyster at another Shifting Tides event. And at that time, Alex McMaster was asking, would you be interested in growing native oysters? And Cian will tell this story about how, well, he did grow them once, and he got married on the back of selling them. I mean, they paid for his wedding. But he then went into how commercially that didn't make sense. But in the fishery exchange conversations, and now I know Suzanne's just talked again to the guys in the Northern Shore, they're all really interested in restoration. So what's your thoughts about how that has shifted?
Yeah, I personally think that's incredible. I think us starting to understand the place that we each play in this ecosystem is really important, and for commercial growers to be in a position to be sort of thinking outside the box a little bit and understand how a wider, healthier ecosystem will then benefit them on the species that they're focused on. I think that's a huge shift. And it's not just something that we're seeing in this realm. I think it's something that we're seeing even in scientific research. This idea of only looking at component parts and everybody just looking at their little piece, there's starting to be a recognition that actually that's not going to work. Or at least it hasn't worked up until this point, and that there is a need for a more cohesive approach to everything we're doing, be that commercial enterprise, socioeconomics, social interaction, scientific research. There is a need to have a much more holistic viewpoint on what it is we're doing and how it fits in with what everybody else is doing.
And have either of you seen, if we start to move to think about how that looks like, what you've just described, are there examples that, you're both pretty aware, when you're researching, you're pretty aware of other communities or other coastal places across the whole world? Who's getting it right? Who is beginning to see, when you say that's fledgling idea of it's a whole system with everybody and everything, and the voice of the loch and the creatures, all part of it. Have you any examples that you're aware of, either of you?
Yeah, I got to go visit a really cool project on the southeast of England in Essex, and that's a pretty large project. They've brought together two oyster fishermen groups, some NGOs and government departments, and a couple of the universities. They were brought together all around the one issue of there's just not a sustainable native oyster population in, I think it's the Blackwater and Crouch estuary. So together they came up with fisheries management plans. There's a volunteer kind of protected area where they do active restoration, or they're putting in adult oysters, and then the fishing that happens adjacent is being supported by that protected population that's reproducing and things like that. And they even looked at it in a circular economy kind of way, where they were able to get waste shell from markets in London, waste oyster shell, to use as culch to lay on the seabed for the restoration work. So it's only been a few years, but it seems like it's quite a successful project, and I'm sure it was uncomfortable at the beginning when they first came into the room, but they're making it work.
And who do you think were the key stakeholders in initiating it? Have you any idea?
I'm not sure who
Yeah, no.
initiated it.
Sarah, have you come across anything?
I think my example for this is maybe something slightly less practical than the project that Heidi's talking about, which is it's starting to happen not only on the ground but also at the policy level. So I was, and probably Heidi as well, where we were involved in the co-design of the blue carbon policy and the co-design of the review of the marine protected areas regulations. And that is the first time really that I have seen active co-design at the policy level. I've seen many other examples of co-design, but that's the first time that I had started to see that as a real piece where lots of opinions were taken on board, and you could start to see all the ideas being pulled together and actually applied when the regulation came out. And that's not just happening here, that's happening in the, or not just happening in the north, it's happening in the south as well. So I was involved with DEC's research and innovation regulation, which again was designed in that true co-design workshop way. And it wasn't just bringing in the usual players of the government bodies and academia, but it was also bringing in NGOs and community groups as well. So I think that's a major step forward, because if we can shape policy, we can shape application.
And so how that policy then trickles down to a local coastal community like the one around Carlingford Lough, do you think that that co-design or that access and influence, I guess, is what are roots emerging at a local level? And would the Lochs Agency have again, a kind of role or potential role in helping find those access routes for co-design around local development?
Yeah, it's very much a route that I'm looking into for the Fisheries Exchange project, because particularly the blue carbon piece policy, there's a need to create sectoral mathematics on carbon storage, and the native oyster restoration work could feed into that. So those are that's the kind of areas that it opens up once community groups through organizations like us can become aware of those mechanisms. It's a way to write projects that hit departmental objectives and are therefore have context and will gain some interest, get some traction.
So that collaborative future planning process, Heidi, would you have any more ideas about how that might look in the context of the social piece that you bring to the table along with the science?
Yeah, I think just building on that, it's really hard at the local level. And just to give an example of a different project I worked on was with anglers. And it was project-based, so it was my job to communicate between the anglers and the department, and there's citizen science built in, so they were collecting data on Elazabranch species, which required them to catch the fish in a certain way. It had to be safe and collect the data in an appropriate way. But that project ended, so I had to move on and get a different job. And then there was a policy change that really impacted how the anglers were able to collect that data. And I wasn't there to do that communicating between the two. So whilst the department didn't feel like they'd done anything wrong, the anglers felt like, oh my God, you just changed this all of a sudden on us, and now you're kind of saying we're not good enough, or, there was just all that trust that had built kind of got demolished immediately. And that's the thing, it takes a really long time to build trust and a second to crush it. So there needs to be something more permanent in place to do that policy engagement, understanding, or dissemination, I don't know what the word is, consistently all the time. Yeah,
absolutely. And maybe parts of those are, those words, the co-design approach, great, an important participatory design. Deliberative, is another word. I think if people have come across the deliberative democracy as associated with big scale citizen assemblies for in Scotland on nature, in the Republic on biodiversity and climate all around the UK. I have seen some examples in Cornwall on having local citizen juries that sit and get to deliberate on the choices so that they're representative of everybody who lives in the community, and they get to hear from any expert groups and also other, opinions, but they deliberate as citizens. And we seem to be seeing a rise of that. Do you think there's some hope for something like that at a local level?
I really do. I think there are a number of examples, even just here on the island of Ireland, where we're starting to see that happen. I can think of a couple of examples where we have been really, truly giving a voice to nature. I'm thinking about the River Faughan, for example, which was, the river gave an impact statement on what happened at the Maboy dump. So those are the sort of things where you can see communities really pushing forward and really having a voice and having some teeth in the argument. I think that's important.
Excellent. So we might get you both to give a little bit of a fast forward. I know another thing, Heidi, that I learned listening to you in the Fishery Exchange was the new word I use a lot now, trophic layers, of building back up for restoration. Maybe you just talk us through, because I think you made it very clear to us that restoration isn't going to happen overnight. So if the vision is restoration of our ecosystems on land and in the sea, they need building blocks, and seagrass and the native oysters are part of that. But would you just kind of walk us through a 10, 20 year, 30 year, it's working, the community's involved, they're like in Craigenish, the example that Alex mentioned on the thing this morning is a community-owned cooperative that are planting the seagrass and planting native oyster spat. Like, can you just kind of walk us through that vision for Carlingford Lough?
Yeah, so the project Alex was talking about is Sea Wilding, based up in Lough Craigenish in Scotland, I think. That was started by sort of one man, and he now has a team together and community support. And the reason they started with oysters and seagrass is because you have to start with your benthic habitats, right? Because that's the home for all the other little small creatures that live there. And then you start to get things higher up in the food web, or your different trophic levels and your bigger fish, and then you're more better placed to talk about that. So for me, the future of Carlingford Lough, or I don't feel like I can say it's my future, but what I would love to be able to see is a lot of energy, right? So that's not just energy moving through the trophic web because you have that amazing nature brought back, but also energy in the people that live there. People are taking joy from being able to live and play and sail and dive, but also, the video we watched, Body of Water, clearly spending time in water has restorative properties, therapeutic properties. I'd say some of the things they were describing even felt a bit transformative. So people should be able to get those health and well-being benefits. We've seen so much art at the back of the room being created, so the loch should be giving us creative inspiration. All of that to me is energy. And I want people to appreciate that, not look past the loch or have their back turned towards it and always be looking inland. Really see it, appreciate it, and live in it and be able to enjoy it.
Sarah, and if you can do it like Heidi with the, it is as an individual, because as you say, you the individual has a part to play. But if you can also expand it to your dream for what the Lough, those kind of things you're starting to explore, if you went 10 and 20 years forward with the Lough Agency or other government engagement with communities, what would that look like, and what would that mean for the Lough? What's your vision?
So my vision is for true collaboration. I feel like 20 years is probably ambitious, but let's push for 20 years. I think that there is, and all of this passion and all of this energy that Heidi's talking about is absolutely fabulous. It's brilliant. That's people having their voices heard. But if we're going to truly be impactful, there needs to be a better top-down approach to how we manage our ecosystems. With the best will in the world, it's not going to come from us as passionate individuals. It has to come from the people that set the regulations, the people that set the laws, and they have to understand that there is a will to do this. So my vision, and I think what I always find myself talking about, is this need to not think about environmental management from a jurisdictional point of view, but to think about it from a biome point of view. Scales in any sort of restoration work, environmental work, scale is vitally important. We have got to make sure that we are managing on appropriate spatial scales, so the appropriate geographical area, and the appropriate time scales. There is no, it's very difficult to make impact in a 2-year project or a 3-year project or a 5-year project. The scales that we're working on have to be appropriate to the ecosystems and the animals that we're trying to protect and restore. And for many of those, we're talking 30+ years. And so there have to be the frameworks in place from the powers that be above to allow us to do that and to allow us to do it at the appropriate scale and for the appropriate period of time. So my big vision is always that we aren't managing pockets of habitat or a sea loch or a catchment. We're looking at it on a biome scale, and we're looking at it from an ecosystem point of view where we're managing land and water and flora and fauna and people holistically.
Thank you. Yeah, I was just going to ask for some questions, so you're getting there. You're just ahead of me. One sec, because when we do questions, I'm going to get you ahead of a microphone, so that Alan will get your question on the piece. So, if you're willing to take questions, yeah, we're going to take a few questions. So I've got 2 hands up. So first, the gentleman who already was so itching to ask his question, he came with it. So, and then there's a person at the back for the next one.
Tommy McKeown. I live locally, and I have to. Sarah is very informed of what we told us about the oyster farming. There's no word of the mussel farming. There, to me, are the pain of me, by the way. I do a row in the loch, and when I go down and say around Narrow you want to see the boat turning around, having done the dredging, what disturbance he's doing to the bed of the loch. That'll never change until they move on.
Sarah, do you want to respond a bit to that? Because I presume, is the Lochs Agency have a role in the licensing of mussel dredging?
No, we don't. We don't.
Okay.
Who has a role in that?
So the shipping channel in Carlingford runs pretty much right up the middle and acts as a delineation. So everything on this side of the shipping channel, all that aquaculture is licensed by DAFM in the south, Department of Agriculture, Food and the Marine, and everything on the sort of County Down side is managed by DERA, Department of Agriculture, Environment and Rural Affairs. Thank you. So, now, Narrow Water is a bit different.
You want to be there to see the disturbance. It's unreal.
So Narrow Water is actually
I know it's a very small area of water we're talking about, but I see the boat turning around, he lifts his tray, and the disturbance is incredible.
So Narrow Water is a public fishery. So it is run as a wild fishery. So they don't have aquaculture licenses like the guys with the big dredgers here do. So the guys with the big dredgers, they have an aquaculture license for an area. It's a bit like a farm. They stock it and they fish it. In Narrow Water, that is a public fishery. So it is wild stocked, if you know what I mean. There's no husbandry.
Yeah, but to me, why the big ones aren't down there is it's too small an area. So now the small ones come down and do the harm, do the damage. I then go further down to the lock gates. It was one Sunday morning after a bit of a storm, but the amount of sewerage in around the lock gates was incredible. I thought I was in a cesspool, by the way.
So either of you want to signpost kind of how this goes into, I guess, the role of planning that you were talking about, that the Lochs Agency isn't creating those plans, does do enforcement, but generally enforcement on other issues? Or do you want to just see if you can map for
Tommy McKeown, by the way.
Tommy?
Yeah, so in terms of community concerns around those sort of fisheries, they do need to be signposted to the licensing authorities. So that would be DERA. I'm afraid I can't help you on that matter. Water pollution, if there is pollution in the water, so for example, a sewage overflow, like Lochs Agency does have a 24-hour pollution hotline. Okay, well, it should just go straight through to the switchboard and then be sent out to an inspector, and we can then go and take point samples, and those samples will be analysed in an accredited lab by NIEA, and we can go from there. The big polluters, so the big pollution events that happen from, for example, sewage outflow, that will get knocked up the line to Northern Ireland Environment Agency.
I'm going to take the question at the back. Thank you for that. And I think Sarah will be here afterwards, so you can continue the conversation about that. And it's interesting to hear you have a 24-hour pollution line, if not getting through all the time, but it's good to know it exists. Your question at the back.
Yeah, my question's about oysters. I don't know a lot about them, but about different species of oysters. And I understood that we have a problem with invasive Pacific oysters, that are wiping the native oysters. Yeah.
Yeah, Heidi, do you want to take that a bit? Because, or, yeah, either of you?
She's a PhD in oysters.
She's a PhD in oysters. Okay. Sarah, I was trying to give you a
dear.
break. I was trying to give you a break there, but yeah, do you want to explain the difference and,
I'll take
and
any
the
seagrass
risks?
question.
My PhD is freshwater. No, so we have a couple, you're right, we have a couple of different species of oysters. So native oyster, Ostrea edulis, is the species, the European species that is native to these shores. And historically, there were thousands of them here. And we had really, really good oyster habitat. In Carlingford Lough, native oyster were all but fished out by hand about 200 years ago. So the oyster species that you see growing on the trestles on the shore that are aquaculture species, there is a Pacific species called Chrysostera gigas. They keep changing their name, but let's go with gigas for now. When they grow those on the shore, they grow them, they are affected in such a way that they can't reproduce, okay? So they're what are called triploid oysters, so they're not capable of spawning. That's the hope. Nature has a great way of trying to revert back. So very occasionally you do get individuals who are capable of spawning. We don't have a big problem with feral, so escaped Pacific oysters in Carlingford Lough. And weirdly, we don't really on Lough Foyle either, but there is a big problem on Lough Swilly. And the issue for them with native oysters is that they are very similar species and they are competing for the same resources. And Pacific oyster are just a slightly more successful animal. They're slightly better at spawning. They're slightly more resilient to disease. They're just a hardier species. And so they do tend to outcompete native oyster for space and light and settlement ground.
Can I add?
Yeah, Heidi?
You're talking about restoring the native ecology of the bay. Wouldn't it be better to be using native
So that's kind of the
oysters?
conversation that we're having. And Heidi, do you want to just to explain about the project you did with Ulster Wildlife a little bit, because you are starting
Yeah.
native oyster spat restoration?
So the goal of native oyster restoration is it's not just like a romantic thing, like this is the species we used to have, so we want it back. They provide a different sort of level of ecosystem services. So native oysters at dense populations will grow on top of each other and create these kind of complex 3D structures, which means they support a huge amount of biodiversity, which is not something that the Pacific oyster does, even though it's this kind of faster growing, better species for farmers to use. So what we want is to be able to establish those reefs for all those wider biodiversity benefits, if that kind of makes sense.
And I suppose the other piece of that, to answer your question on why we don't grow native oyster are not as commercially valuable a species because it's much harder to grow them. They don't respond well to growing in trestles or growing in bags. They don't grow well. They don't put on meat. They get very stressed very quickly. And so the commercial growers can't really make money at them using aquaculture. You can fish them if you have a dense enough wild population like they do on Lough Foyle. You can fish them, but they're fished more like a wild fish species, more like you would fish for herring or cod or something, where they're a naturally regenerating population and then you fish out at a quota.
Yeah, with a quota to mind how much of the native population stays. But in terms of Heidi, the projects in Belfast and Bangor.
Yeah. So we copied a kind of setup that had been proven to work in other parts of the UK. It's called a native oyster nursery, and this is an Ulster Wildlife project. So we established it first in Bangor Marina. So underneath the piers where all the boats are moored up, we hung these big cages that had all these different levels in them, and on each level we put 3 or 4 oysters in there, adult oysters, I think, but when we put them in, and having maybe like 20 or 30 cages in the marina with the oysters all close together, encourage them to spawn, because they're weird. They won't actually produce any spawn unless there's another oyster within like a couple of meters of them. They're really picky. So we kept them all together. They're feeling safe, and then the idea is hopefully they would spawn, and the currents would bring the larvae out to settle into the loch. So that was just kind of the first go at it. We had to work through, this hadn't been done before, so we had to work through the policy kind of figure out how to do that, basically, because there isn't any legislation or policy in place to support restoration work. It's usually to manage an aquaculture farm or a fisheries license or something like that. So we were working through that. And once we kind of figured out it worked and our oysters all stayed alive for that few years, Ulster Wildlife continued to grow that project by setting up oysters all around Belfast Loch, with the idea that they are hopefully going to help regenerate the population within the loch, and they're building on that now by doing some. I think they're working through the license to be able to lay culch and adult oysters actually onto the seabed itself. The reason we established it in Belfast Loch in the first place was because in 2020 there was a survey done by a couple of lecturers at Queen's, Dave Smith and Louise Crichton. They had done a survey along the loch and found adult native oysters, and were thinking, okay, they're not actually completely extinct like that we thought they were from the loch. So there was some hope there, I guess, and that's why Ulster Wildlife is continuing that work.
And so that's one of the potential conversations that's going on with the oyster farmers here on the loch around the potential to grow adult native oysters, not for commercial sale, for eating them, but to help with restoration work. So that's one of the magical things that has come out of the Fishery Exchange. So listen, is there any burning questions? Anyone else got a burning question? So I think we're going to wrap the panel up for now, but both Heidi and Sarah are staying on for another little while. Thanks to both of you for outlining, we know it's complex, and I think that a lot of the time we're trying to bridge through the webinars we've done, through the panels we've done, all that complexity, so as that people living in the area, so as that ordinary citizens do have an understanding of, what our roles. If there was one sort of small shift today that you think could bring a big change in the loch for anybody in the audience that they could get involved with, or that you think anybody's organisation could be doing, what do you think that one small shift, and it might touch on the visions you both said?
I have 2 points on this. Leah was talking earlier about the film she made and then the knock-on effects that it had, where divers got reinvigorated with their survey and got in the water. So for me, it's not there's one specific thing. But there is one thing for you. So whatever your interests are, whatever your skills are, use that to get involved. Maybe you're a writer, maybe you take photographs, or you're really good on TikTok. Or you like to do the citizen science thing and gain knowledge. Just get involved in some way. And it's not just about restoring the ecology, it's about restoring connection to the loch. And that's why I really enjoyed learning from Kane, who runs the Carlingford Oysters business, because he brings people out into the water. He gets them in wellies, and you stand next to the trestles and you learn about how you grow them, and he's reconnecting people to the species, to their food and how it grows. So finding a way to build that connection is really important, and one of the best ways to do that is to notice 3 good things about nature. So every time you go out, what are 3 good things? Just think about it, and then you'll feel that sense of connection growing each time.
Sarah?
Yeah, for me, it's probably really close to what Heidi is saying. I think just remember that passion is really infectious. That's how you bring people along. That's how you instill in them this idea that we as humans are not different from animals. We are part of this ecosystem, and we need to get back to the point of recognizing just the intrinsic value that the system has on our lives, and just talk to people, tell people, because as I say, spread your knowledge, passion is infectious, and yeah, be generous with the knowledge that you have.
Lovely, thank you. And you've both been very generous with the knowledge that you have, both here and with the Fishery Exchange.
Thanks.